It all started on a regular Sunday afternoon when I decided to install a brand new fence around my property. It wasn't just any fence, it was a beautiful, solid 6 feet tall, made of cedar wood, giving my backyard the privacy it desperately needed. I had spent months planning the design, choosing the materials, and getting everything just right. I'd never been a fan of the prying eyes of neighbors or the noise from the street, and this fence was the perfect solution. Plus, I was eager to enhance the look of my property and increase its value. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over my backyard as I tightened the last screws into place. The fence stood tall and proud, a barrier between my home and the outside world. I stepped back to admire the finished work, surveying the neatly aligned posts and smooth wooden panels. I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. I had done it myself, after all. My backyard now felt like a true sanctuary, a space where I could relax after a long workday, enjoy quiet weekends, or even host a barbecue without worrying about my neighbors watching me. It was perfect. The space felt cozy, secluded, and private, everything I had envisioned. Little did I know, however, that this simple act of home improvement would soon spark a series of events that would leave me in utter disbelief and change the way I saw my seemingly peaceful neighborhood forever. As I was standing there, lost in the satisfaction of my hard work, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, walking her little dog down the sidewalk in front of my house. I waved cheerfully, expecting a friendly exchange, maybe even a compliment about my newly installed fence. But to my surprise, she didn't acknowledge me at all. Instead, she just gave me a cold stare, her eyes narrowing as she walked right past. I stood there, somewhat taken aback. Mrs. Jenkins was usually a friendly enough person, but this time, she didn't even give a polite wave. I shook off the awkwardness and returned to my fence, assuming she was just in a bad mood or distracted by her dog. However, there was something about the way she glared at the fence that caught my attention. It was almost as if she was studying it, as though she didn't approve of it being there. I didn't give it much thought at the time, but in hindsight, I should have seen the storm brewing just behind that cold look. Over the next few days, I continued enjoying the peace that the fence brought me, but I began to notice that Mrs. Jenkins wasn't the only one who seemed to have an issue. I'd catch a few of my other neighbors glancing over their fences, whispering to each other, and then quickly looking away when they saw me. It felt odd. At first, I figured it was just the novelty of the fence causing a bit of a stir. Maybe they were jealous of how great it looked, or maybe they thought it was a little too high for the neighborhood's aesthetic. But one evening, as I was sitting on my porch, I saw Mrs. Jenkins again. This time, she wasn't alone. She was talking to another neighbor, Mr. Thompson, and they were both pointing in my direction. Their heads turned in sync, like a pair of vultures watching a prey animal. I felt an uncomfortable pang in my gut, sensing that something wasn't quite right. I had learned over the years that when people start talking behind your back, something's coming, and in this case, I had a gut feeling that something wasn't going to go my way. Sure enough, it wasn't long before the dreaded letter arrived. The envelope was from the Homeowners Association, HOA. At first, I thought it might be some general update or maybe an invitation to the next community event, but as I tore it open, my heart sank. The letter stated that my new fence was in violation of the HOA's regulations and that I was required to remove it immediately. According to the HOA's rules, fences couldn't be taller than 5 feet in the front yard, and the height restriction for side and backyard fences wasn't any clearer. They claimed that my 6-foot fence was a violation, even though I had carefully reviewed the community guidelines and gotten the necessary permits. I couldn't believe it. I had done everything by the book. I even went out of my way to make sure the fence was tasteful, inoffensive, and fit with the neighborhood's aesthetic. And yet, here I was, staring at this letter demanding its removal. Frustrated and confused, I decided to take action. I reached out to the HOA, hoping they could provide more clarity on the matter. But when I called the office, I was met with an indifferent tone. The woman on the other end of the line informed me that the rules were clear and that I needed to take the fence down. No negotiation, no flexibility. I was dumbfounded. It felt like I had done everything right, but now it seemed like I was being punished for wanting a bit of privacy. But the worst was yet to come. Mrs. Jenkins, it turned out, was not just a disapproving neighbor, she was actively involved in the HOA. And unbeknownst to me, she had taken it upon herself to escalate the situation further. A few days after receiving the letter, I was shocked when Mrs. Jenkins showed up at my door, phone in hand, and a self-righteous expression on her face. Without a word, she informed me that she had already called 911. Yes, she had called the police. She claimed that my 6-foot fence was a violation of community safety and was threatening to the neighborhood. The very next morning, as I sipped my coffee and prepared to enjoy my newfound sense of privacy, the last thing I expected was to find a letter from the HOA in my mailbox. It was a neatly folded piece of paper in a standard HOA envelope, the kind that always carried bad news. I took a deep breath before opening it, hoping that it was just some generic newsletter or community announcement. But as I read the first few lines, my stomach dropped. The letter informed me that my newly installed fence was in direct violation of the community's regulations. Apparently, according to the HOA's rules, fences couldn't exceed 5 feet in height in the front yard. The letter clearly stated that my 6-foot fence, which I had installed in my backyard, was 1 foot taller than the permitted height and was considered a structure out of compliance. I felt like I had just been slapped in the face. The thing that really stung was that I had done everything by the book. I had spent countless hours reading through the community guidelines and even consulted with the HOA prior to installing the fence to ensure it complied with their rules. I obtained all the necessary permits, hired professionals to install the fence, and made sure that it was not only functional but aesthetically pleasing. The fence was made of high-quality cedar wood, designed to blend with the natural surroundings. I had taken great care to make sure it enhanced the look of my property and added value to the community. So when I saw that letter telling me to take down my fence, it felt like a complete betrayal. I was being told that after all the time, money, and effort I had invested in improving my home, it was all for nothing. But I wasn't about to give up without a fight. I'd worked hard for this fence, and it wasn't going anywhere. Determined to clear things up, I immediately picked up the phone and dialed the HOA office. I needed answers. I wasn't about to let a minor misunderstanding ruin everything I had worked for. When someone finally picked up, I explained my situation, how I had carefully followed the rules, obtained the proper permits, and ensured the fence was within the community's guidelines. I figured the HOA would appreciate my efforts and, at the very least, acknowledge that I had done everything correctly. But the person on the other end of the line was less than sympathetic. I could feel her lack of interest through the phone. She quickly rattled off the same scripted response, telling me that the fence was indeed over the height limit and had to be removed. When I asked for clarification about the specific rules regarding backyard fences, she seemed unable or unwilling to provide any. She repeated that the decision was final and that the HOA had no flexibility in the matter. It was as if my concerns were of no importance. I explained that I had checked all the guidelines and had even gotten approval from the HOA before installing the fence. But she brushed me off, saying there was nothing that could be done, and insisted that I had to remove the fence. I felt like I was talking to a brick wall. As the conversation continued, I began to feel a wave of frustration building up inside me. How could this be happening? How could they ignore the fact that I had followed all the rules? It was clear to me that the situation was being treated with an absolute lack of consideration for the effort I had put in. There was no room for negotiation, no opportunity for understanding, just a hard-line stance that my fence was a violation and that I would have to take it down. But I wasn't ready to back down. I wasn't going to let the HOA, or anyone for that matter, tell me to tear down something that I had worked so hard on, especially when I knew I had followed every step. I could feel my determination rising. This wasn't just about the fence, it was about standing up for my rights as a homeowner and making sure my voice was heard. I decided that I wouldn't let the HOA walk all over me. I was going to do whatever it took to prove that I had done things the right way. After all, if the HOA had given me the green light to proceed with the installation in the first place, how could they now turn around and say I was in the wrong? This had to be some kind of misunderstanding, or at the very least, a miscommunication that could be resolved. I hung up the phone with the HOA and began brainstorming a plan. I wasn't going to accept this as the final word. There had to be a way to clear my name and keep my fence standing. And I wasn't about to let a vague set of rules and a dismissive phone call dictate the outcome of this situation. I knew I had a right to a fair hearing, and I would make sure I got it. It was time to dig deeper. I was going to review the HOA's guidelines once again and find any loopholes or details that could work in my favor. Maybe I'd consult a lawyer to get professional advice. Whatever it took, I was going to fight for what I believed in, and that fence wasn't coming down without a fight. Things took a dramatic turn for the worse just a few days after my frustrating conversation with the HOA. I was enjoying a quiet morning, sipping my coffee and catching up on some emails, when I noticed Mrs. Jenkins walking up my driveway again. This time, however, there was something different. She was holding her phone, a stern expression on her face, and her pace seemed quicker than usual. As she got closer, I waved to her, expecting a simple greeting or perhaps a polite complaint about the fence. But instead of acknowledging me, she simply ignored the wave and kept walking directly toward my front door. I was a bit taken aback but decided to stay calm. Maybe she just wanted to discuss something further. Maybe the HOA had finally made a decision, and she was here to tell me the news. I opened the door, ready to listen, but what happened next was something I could never have anticipated. Without so much as a word, Mrs. Jenkins looked at me with a triumphant smirk and immediately dropped the bombshell. She had called 911 on me. Yes, you read that correctly. She had actually called the police because, according to her, my fence was too tall and was a threat to the community. I stood there in complete disbelief. How could a 6-foot fence, made of wood, no less, pose any kind of danger to the community? How could someone think that this was something that required police intervention? My mind was racing as I tried to process what she had just said. Was I really about to get in trouble for something so minor? I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I heard the faint sound of sirens approaching in the distance. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up outside my house, and I was left standing there, trying to calm my rapidly increasing heart rate. The officer who stepped out of the car looked like he had just come from a regular shift, not expecting any kind of emergency, let alone a fence-related debacle. He wore a neutral expression as he made his way to my front door. "Good morning, sir," the officer greeted me. "We received a call about a fence that's apparently posing some kind of threat to the community." I was taken aback by the sheer absurdity of the situation. I had expected a minor dispute with the HOA, but now I was facing a police officer over something that, frankly, seemed ridiculous. As I explained the situation, that my fence was within the legal height limits, had been installed with permits, and was built to be a private and peaceful addition to my property, the officer simply nodded and gestured toward the fence. "I don't see the problem," he said, after taking a quick look at the structure. "It's just a fence." He stood there for a moment longer, observing the fence, then turned back to Mrs. Jenkins, who was standing behind him with her arms crossed, watching the entire exchange intently. It was clear she was hoping for some form of action, some sort of punishment or penalty, but the officer wasn't having it. "Unless there's a legitimate safety hazard here," he continued, "there's not much we can do about it." He turned back to me and gave a shrug. "Honestly, it's just a fence. There's no need to worry about it unless it's causing harm or blocking access to something important." It was then that I realized the officer saw this for exactly what it was, an unnecessary and petty complaint, a disruption over something completely harmless. Mrs. Jenkins, however, was visibly displeased. She stood there, her arms still tightly crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line, and I could tell that she was fuming with frustration. She had obviously expected the officer to back her up, to tell me to tear down my fence and restore order to the community. But that wasn't happening. The officer, seeing that Mrs. Jenkins was not going to relent, calmly told her, "Ma'am, unless there's an immediate threat or violation of law here, there's nothing we can do. I suggest you reach out to the HOA for further action if you still have concerns." With that, the officer turned, got into his car, and drove away, leaving me standing there, trying to absorb the sheer ridiculousness of what had just transpired. As the officer drove off, I looked at Mrs. Jenkins, who was still standing there, looking like she had been robbed of her moment of victory. The tension was palpable as she glared at me, muttered something under her breath, and stormed off down the driveway. The whole situation left me feeling bewildered, but at the same time, a sense of relief washed over me. The officer's response had made it clear that this entire situation was nothing more than a petty, baseless complaint. It felt good to know that my rights were being respected, even though Mrs. Jenkins seemed to think otherwise. But as much as I was relieved that the police had seen sense, I knew deep down that this wouldn't be the last I heard of Mrs. Jenkins. She hadn't given up yet, and I wasn't naive enough to think this whole ordeal was over. No, there was still more to come. The HOA hadn't dropped the issue, and Mrs. Jenkins clearly wasn't about to stop her crusade against my fence. But at least now, I had some leverage. The police had seen through her exaggerated concerns, and that made me feel more confident than ever that I could fight this battle and win. I knew I had to act fast if I wanted to win this battle. The HOA was still insisting that I take the fence down, and Mrs. Jenkins, clearly not ready to give up, was still on her crusade to have it removed. But I wasn't about to let her or the HOA push me around. I had worked hard for this fence, and I wasn't about to let anyone tell me to tear it down without a fight. The first step in my plan was to do some serious research. I wasn't going to rely on anyone else's interpretation of the HOA's regulations. I needed to dive into the actual guidelines myself. So, I grabbed the HOA handbook, sat down at my desk, and began combing through the fine print with a fine-tooth comb. It didn't take long before I stumbled across something that could be my saving grace: the height restriction for fences applied specifically to front yards, not backyards. My 6-foot fence was entirely in my backyard, well out of public view and not visible from the street. This was a crucial detail that could turn the whole situation on its head. I felt a surge of hope as I read over the wording again. The HOA had no legal grounds to force me to remove the fence because it was in full compliance with their own rules for backyards. With this new knowledge in hand, I drafted a detailed letter to the HOA. In the letter, I laid out the relevant sections of the regulations, pointed out the exact loophole in their complaint, and made it clear that their request to remove the fence was both unreasonable and legally unfounded. I emphasized that my fence posed no risk to the community and was installed with all the required permits. I also suggested that if there was any confusion regarding the rules, I would be happy to have a meeting to discuss the matter further. But I didn't stop there. I knew that the HOA would be more likely to listen if I could show them that I wasn't alone in this. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't the only one who had issues with the HOA's rules. I knew that many of my neighbors felt the same way. Some were frustrated with the overly restrictive guidelines, while others had their own grievances about the HOA's heavy-handed approach to property management. So, I decided to take my fight to the people. I went door to door, explaining my situation to my neighbors and asking if anyone else had encountered similar issues with the HOA. I explained that I wasn't just fighting for my fence, but for fairness and common sense in the community's regulations. To my surprise, several of my neighbors were more than willing to sign a petition supporting me and my fence. It turns out, many of them were just waiting for someone to stand up to the HOA. In a matter of days, I had gathered signatures from more than half of the households on my street. Armed with both my legal argument and the petition, I sent everything to the HOA, demanding that they reconsider their stance. The moment they received my petition and saw the widespread support from my neighbors, things changed quickly. Within a week, I received a response from the HOA. They apologized for the misunderstanding, acknowledged the loophole in their regulations, and agreed to review the community's guidelines. They even said they were open to making adjustments to the rules to make them more reasonable and in line with current homeowner needs. Not only did I get to keep my fence, but I had also sparked a much-needed conversation within the HOA about the outdated and overly restrictive policies that many residents found frustrating. The changes to the regulations would make it easier for homeowners to improve their properties without the fear of facing unreasonable pushback from the association. The victory felt even sweeter knowing that I had helped improve the community for everyone. The sweet victory and what I learned in the end, I came out victorious. My fence remained standing, and Mrs. Jenkins learned that she couldn't just call the cops every time something didn't go her way. The HOA also changed a few of their rules, making them more reasonable and flexible for residents. It wasn't a huge victory, but it was a significant one. I had stood up for myself, and my actions had led to a change that benefited not just me, but my entire neighborhood. So, what did I learn from this experience? Sometimes, standing up for what's right, even if it feels like a small issue, can lead to bigger changes. I realized that taking the time to educate myself about the rules and regulations gave me the power to challenge the system. Knowledge really is power. I also learned the importance of community support. I could have fought this battle alone, but the fact that my neighbors rallied behind me made all the difference. When we stand together, we can push back against unfair systems and create change. In the future, if I ever find myself in a similar situation, I will remember this experience and know that persistence, knowledge, and the support of a community can go a long way. The next time someone tries to mess with your property, don't back down. Stand firm in what you believe is right. You may find that, just like me, you come out on top. The fight for what's yours is always worth it.